No.
No,
Recording.
no, the recording in pro. Yep. Okay.
Okay. So all good.
Okay.
Gee, you're running this, so I'll stay back.
Okay, thank you. I will try to guide the discussion. I just sent the Etherpad link to the chat window. People who want to collaborate on it, please just do it. And I see Xiaohu also joined our meeting, so I think probably that's all we have today. So maybe you can take a look at the Etherpad with at least some of the things we need to discuss today. First is logistics. I think we have has helped with the recording of the meeting. That's good. And the Etherpad, we already have it. And the next thing is time for the next conference call. I think we got some complaints from Robert about the time. I feel sorry about that because I thought he was also in the US. But for the next meeting, maybe I see Randy already shared some candidate time slots. And so you think we need, if we need another conference call, we can have another pool, doodle pool, to find another more suitable time slot for the meeting. Maybe just following Randy's suggestion on the time. And the next is the GitHub repository. I think we have asked the chair to create a repository, and maybe hopefully we can get it soon. But before that, we can also continue the discussion of the mail list and.
Hi, Tiger.
Hi, I'm here.
I can hear. We can hear your family. Yeah.
It's rather
the
cheery,
cubs.
actually.
You at home?
I'm working at home.
We can hear.
Okay, so for the repository, we can check later with the chairs. That's all for the logistics. What else? Do I miss anything else?
This is Warren.
The suggestion I was going to make, I think, is under requirements list, just in terms of decomposing things into two subcategories there. One is, what does BGP actually need for session setup and session types? The other one is transport, session, and discovery. I think those are slightly different.
Okay. We can think about it, how to separate these two kind of things. And next is, I think this is the of this design team. I think quoted from John's mail, we need to discuss the requirements first, and also the solution space, outline the solution space, so that we can give some input to the working group to produce a solution. Okay, I see there's already some discussion about the scenario we want to cover. There are several different scenarios like the WAN, IXP, and data center. We need to cover all of this, or we want to do it we want to cover maybe the data center case as the initial step. Based on some previous mail list discussion, I think we have some rough consensus to work on the data center first. Is there any other comments about this scenario?
So I agree. We want to do data center first. It's worth spending at least a portion of our time just simply discussing why the other ones might be different.
Yep, this is Warren. I agree. I mean, it's also possible that once we've figured out the data center one, we discover that it works perfectly well for everything else as well, in which case, hey, profit.
Do you think
Probably the use cases have little permutations compared to anything else. There are only so many ways you can connect things.
Warren, do you think the odds of that would be improved or diminished if we kept our eye on the other ones while we were discussing the data center?
I think it's probably worth keeping our eye, or sort of keeping it at least in the back of our heads while looking at it. But we do potentially run the risk of making things more complex than it needs to be.
Agreed.
Too much in mind.
Or
It's just my thought.
Or maybe the danger and of that complexity would force us to keep everything simpler.
That's true. I think that the complexity is going to be something we have to keep a constant eye on, because I think we're
I would use a heavier
inclined to
object.
complicate.
But yes, for the nonce, our main subject is data center. I think I have no problem with that.
Okay. Yeah, that's why I think we also had some similar discussion on the list, whether we want to keep it simple, like we just identify a minimal set of the requirements on the functions, or we also want to expand it a little bit to include some optional features that which can be maybe useful and required by some particular scenarios. So this is also whether my suggestion is maybe we just first identify the minimal set of the like a mandatory or features which are needed in most of the data center cases. Then we can also expand it later. Yeah.
And the exercise that I would hope to do is not meant to be something that continually rat holes us over and over again on what's same or what's different. The properties we care about are going to be probably very clear up front, and it's just simply in or out of scope for data center.
And probably from underlay perspective, 7938 describe really good use cases, and I believe most deployments who deploy BGP and underlay today follow them one another way.
We can follow that some use cases in that document, and I see we already have some solution drafts exist, and some of them are also list some of the requirements, so we can also check whether some of them are in common and can be listed as the minimal set of the requirements here.
Yeah, I agree with that. The fact that we can take a look at we've had several people come up with very similar ideas. The BGP properties, I think, will fall out fastest from that. The transport session configuration and discovery, I think, will be the thing that is most different from the different proposals.
And if we agree to work on the data center case first, maybe we can summarize some of these discussions on the mail list about the features. Like for the data center case, we consider only the point-to-point connections, or we also need to consider the multi-hop case. This is one question we discussed on the mail list, and maybe we can figure out whether we need to cover both, or we can just simply consider the point-to-point, either using the interface address or loopback address.
I have a clarification question on that one.
Okay.
When people tend to think about BGP peering from loopback, that's typically not eBGP style point-to-point. So if we're considering that as a base case, does that mean we're already considering multi-hop as some form is in scope?
Yeah, I think this was G's question. So to my point of what I see in the field, underlay is 99.9% is point-to-point, while overlay over it, it's very often on loopback.
You know,
So this is
one,
for,
I mean, that's just one thing. When we were thinking of this, this was just way back, Kayer and I, we thought it might be nice to not have to have addresses on, unique addresses on the links. Just have one loop back. So we put that into the set of requirements. One loop, which in the data center, I'm saying.
You mean IP unnumbered style?
Exactly.
and this is Warren. I think there are actually sort of more than two cases that it feels to me that there's point-to-point, which is understood, and then there's multi-hop, which is going through a device. But it feels like multi-hop between loopbacks is somehow different or between the two. Because it's not that something else behind a device needs to know it. So while it is technically multi-hop, it sort of feels different.
Is anybody speaking for multi-hop other than loopback in the data center?
I've never seen something different.
We want to clarify whether there's any requirement to have the multi-hop other than the loopback.
That's what I just asked, I think.
Yeah.
Good question.
So not necessarily traditional data center, but data center interconnect scenarios in some cases resemble multi-hop eBGP.
Data center connect, what's that?
Data center interconnect, basically one data center talking to another data center, potentially over a tunneled interface, but not necessarily.
Yeah, so over the top DCI, which is the first option, is actually it's similar to option C. So the VPN AFI session between router and reflector. But I think this kind of out of scope of this work.
Thank you.
It might be worth us noting somewhere that that's out of scope.
Wow.
Okay.
We want to identify the data center interconnection case as another scenario from the data center scenario we want to discuss as a first step.
No, I think I'm just suggesting that we write down somewhere that we're not trying to solve the multi-hop that goes through a device discovery problem.
But I think a sub of that was G Dong is correctly asking whether he should minute that inter-data center using technologies such as VPN are out of scope. And I would support that statement. It's a sub-statement of the larger statement. The EVPN people sometimes think, oh my God, we've got the same address.
If someone wants to negotiate VPN AFI on top, why would it be out of scope? I don't think we are limiting any AFI-SAFI combination to be communicated between two peers, aren't we?
And what about communication between data center and a backbone, and communication between data center? You know, we're trying, by data center, we didn't say data centers.
I think that data center has very clear boundaries with regards to what fabric is versus the boundary is always on DCI or DC gateway router. We can clearly identify where auto discovery stops. And probably you don't want to try to negotiate something with third-party devices not under your administration.
Or over funny tunnels.
Yeah, even more so.
Right. So one way to look at it is when you have a device that is doing auto discovery, it obviously doesn't want to auto discover towards everything. So auto discovering as a participant in a fabric towards the fabric makes sense. Participating in auto discovery towards some arbitrary tunnel probably does not.
So this is, Warren, again, something we're going to have to keep in mind or outline is how one tells the difference.
Exactly. And that's sort of what I was leading to, is that what we've identified as a functional property is that there should be some form of scoping. The word's probably overbroad, but you have to figure out what you're configuring auto configuration on.
Yep.
Most of us probably think that's a set of interfaces. And that's effectively one of the properties we care about.
Okay, I guess maybe terminology, but I kind of thought it was configuring it on a switch or something like that. When I plug it in, it discovers and comes up.
Well, let me give a practical example towards the fabric case. Several people's designs for their fabrics will sometimes have links out of the fabric at one of the spine nodes. So that means that some interfaces, it's like you can't just say this thing is a switch, we auto-config on everything. What you're really saying is some of these interfaces are for the fabric and should auto-configure towards the fabric.
Yeah, it's a management plane function of, give a role to a port where one can negotiate versus where one cannot.
I mean, the other way of doing it is you auto-configure everything, and then everything that's outside the fabric just refuses to participate.
Yeah.
Does that make you happy from a security perspective?
Do the same for LDP. You would never enable LDP with external party.
Hand up.
Yep.
Warren, if you have two of these monsters, how do they know as each other are out? Moving right along.
Okay. I mean, I've seen some set of things where people don't necessarily know, don't have full faith ahead of time that everything will be hooked up the way they believe with the ports, right?
I understand that.
When people install it, sometimes ports end up miswired. And
about 9% of the time, yes.
And so some people would like to be able to recover from that in some way other than having people go back and plug things in. They turn things up, run an auto discovery thing, and say, this port I thought was going there, but it's not. That's okay. I'll just change my sort of back-end model, not change the wiring.
Right. So that's another property. We mentioned that scoping is something we need to figure out what that means, and how we actually decide which things are scoped towards that. What you're also talking about is that these things may need to be able to detect misconnectivity. And what that actually will mean will depend on the scenario that's in. In a data center context, if you're talking about simple 2 or 3 layer fabrics, basically where you are in the fabric is one way to at least help figure that out.
Yeah. I mean, if I could know ahead of time exactly which ports were going where and what everything was correctly connected to, and configured that at some point, I wouldn't need any of this. I wouldn't need to auto set up BGP because I would know that port 27 goes to switch 19, which is IP'd like this and addressed like that. So
I think you're confusing or confounding knowing which port on my device I want to speak on and what to expect at the other end of it. It's what's to expect at the other end of it that can be surprising.
That's true. Think. I'll need to think about that.
Yeah. That includes some like validation of the allowed peers, right? If you want to have this kind of control, you will need maybe some pre-configuration of like a list of peers which you want, or a range of peers which you want to communicate with.
For your thought of list of peers, since in many of these cases the devices may not have pre-assigned numbering, what do you think that means?
You mean the IP address or the AS number?
Let's fall into some of the considerations I consider templating. So, using the simple 2 or 3 layer switch fabric example, people like in their, especially their 3-layer switches, often to give the aggregation and the spine layer, the same AS number at each of the layers to prevent, some of the BGP packet bouncing, from without that you get without having unique addresses, unique AS numbers assigned. So part of the property there is if you are a node in a given position, in 2 of the positions, you know what your AS number probably is a priori. In the case of the leaf nodes, you may not necessarily care what your AS number is, but you need a unique AS number.
Yes.
And this is about another like requirement whether we need to discover the role of the peer using in the auto configuration. Like Jeff just mentioned, the one like a use case of the when you know the role of the peer, you can do something automatically, or you can have some validation about whether you should set up the session or not. So I think there's some discussion about whether we can determine how to advertise roles based on the role, like the prefix limit, or whether we can send the full table.
If you look at Rift, we use single device that's set, and then we can really compute whether devices are parallel, low, or up to you. We could theoretically think of same algorithm here. You just need a device that lives at particular level in the fabric, and then the rest is relative to it. In Rift, we propose this kind of, it's part of auto discovery.
Rift.
Rift. Like in Italian, Rift.
One of the properties that we also just touched on is in some cases, we can't do, just locally pick something. So like link local peering, this makes some of the situations very easy because we don't care what the addresses are in the link. We just need that the numbers eventually become unique, and things like duplicate address discovery will do much of our work for us. In some of the cases, some of the resources need to be uniquely generated, like the AS numbers of the leaves. Doing that sort of thing in a fully distributed fashion, certainly mechanisms for doing so, but they're very messy. So you have to decide how do unique resource mappings, like AS numbers, actually get done.
So for this AS number, and we may need some pre-configuration, right? The thing is, I see some of the requirements mention that whether we signal our own the node should signal its own AS number to its peers, or it should also signal something more than this? Is that whether this is something it's optional, or we think it's mandatory to signal this thing in the auto discovery stage?
There are plenty of implementations which reject an open from an unexpected over a link where she thinks she knows what's at the other end of that link, the AS number of the other end of the link.
So
In other words, A opens towards B and says, I think you are 32. And if B doesn't think she's 32, it fails.
How do you feel comfortable with that in terms of security?
Are we
So this is
defining BGP?
I'm thinking that depending what you're talking about, like for fabrics, that's probably okay in many cases, depends on what your misconnectivity detection looks like using those mechanisms. If you're trying to use this for non-data center, that property is perhaps less attractive.
So this is Warren. That kind of ties back into my earlier, is this per interface or per device? We do mention authentication, or at least we have in the past mentioned authentication through this as well.
What we meant,
Feels like
or what some of us meant, was agreeing on the shared secret for TCP protection.
okay, so sorry, I was thinking
The MD5 key is not exchanged in the open. It is half known beforehand.
okay, I was thinking that was actually, I could encrypt my message, my open messages, or these discovery messages with my configured key. And then if you don't have the same key, you wouldn't be able to decrypt it. And so we would never do
Slow down.
no discovery.
Go slow. MD5 TCP protection for peers is the way it actually works is I have a list of possible peers. I receive a SYN. That SYN, I check against the list of peers with that connecting address. And it must match one of them, and then I have the session key. I'm sure Jeff has written this code too.
Thankfully, I have not. But, my concern there is that while I understand what you're asking to do,
That's what happens.
well, certainly for key rollovers, that's
No, that's what happens on BGP Open. New session that's going to be protected with MD5. The SYN is protected.
Oh, the SYN is absolutely protected. I agree with that. And
So how do
therefore,
I know which? So I get a SYN in with a key.
many implementations multiplex that initially against the incoming IP address. It's not hidden.
Right.
So I guess my concern is not that. It's just that in a case where you're trying to actually provide a discovery component in it, where you don't necessarily have pre-provisioning of what the things are at the other side, you would have potentially a very, very long list of keys.
Which is why I'm kind of heading towards that in the auto discovery exchange. The key is exchanged. Then you've only got the question of protecting that exchange.
I see. So I had left this a little bit vague in the document I did with AC for LLDP, but the discussion that we'd had is we're not so much exchanging the actual key itself. I don't know if that's what you actually meant. They exchange basically a key ID be used to look up in a local key table.
Okay, this is Warren. I completely misunderstood the authentication part of this then. I had thought that it was that I could authenticate the person I was talking to in the discovery part.
I don't think you did, Warren, because I think there are actually two distinct pieces of authentication in this discussion. I believe you're correct that we do want to have authentication in the discovery mechanism itself. There are things that are worth protecting in there. Part of the properties we're trying to give along with transport endpoints for the discovery will probably need to be enough things for the transport security as well for the BGP.
Okay.
They're both true.
Okay, cool. Does everybody agree with that? We are also wanting to authenticate or in some way secure the discovery. Or is that just our
Not
understanding?
sure that transport security may be too restrictive a term. I can secure the object, not just the instead of the transport.
Certainly.
Yes. Okay.
No,
But we do agree that we do want
for those people who aren't very far down this rabbit hole, is that Warren and I could, in the discovery, is the whatever blob is being exchanged, instead of trying to do it over a secure transport, the blob could, for instance, be signed with a key that is global to the data center. In other words, object security as opposed to transport security.
Hello, can you hear me?
Barely.
It's great
Not-
that we all agree that we should focus on the DC scenario at first. For the DC scenario, maybe we should focus on the most common problem faced by the current DP deployment data center.
Xiaohu, can you speak a little louder?
Okay. In the data center, currently we face two major issues within Alibaba data centers. First issue is since there are a lot of peers within the data center fabric, we want to use an automatic mechanism to establish BGP sessions. The second issue is since there are many parallel links between each device peers, there would be many BGP sessions to advertise unnecessary duplicated BGP updates. So we want to reduce the BGP sessions between each device peers. Those two problems have been mentioned in the BGP auto discovery draft. Since we are now trying to list all the requirements for DC requirement, for DC scenario, I suggest we should first identify the most common problem we solved. Then we list those related requirements.
Point of order, could whoever's message notifications are going ding, 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 turn off their laptop mic?
Hello?
Somebody's is, aside from you being a little too quiet, somebody's message notifier is going ding, ding, ding. There's one now. Could whoever that was, please could they please mute?
Should be fine now.
Thank you. So Xiaohu, your second point about reducing the sessions between peers, I think that's probably a worthwhile thing to do, but it's slightly out of scope strictly of discovery.
That's
It's probably-
architecture.
It is architecture, I agree. Is that a problem that we want to do as discovery, or is that a problem that we want to do because it's effectively a change in the BGP protocol?
Or how you wire your data center.
Then we might be
guys,
interpreting this differently. Randy, would you go through what you think he said?
You can have,
To reduce the number of BP sessions between peers, the most direct way is to config BP sessions over loopbacks, but we also want to avoid menu configuration. That's why we need a mechanism to carry the peer back addresses. And we can establish BGP sessions over.
So that, depending on the environment, that could be as simple as just filtering non-unique and not establishing peers, right?
So let me clarify what I think is being asked.
Okay.
So we have two BGP speakers, A and B. And we have 100 links between them. This is something people do. So they have, from a BGP perspective, the same router ID. That's the same thing exchanged between the open messages. The same sets of ASs on each side. You have a distinct peer address on each link. And what BGP does today is if you have some prefix that is being advertised between routers A and B, you will get 100 copies across 100 sessions.
are these parallel physical links?
That is what I believe he is saying.
Non-lagged.
Yeah.
BGP L3 ECMP.
So Warren, sorry, this is Warren. I just want to confirm this is between two peers, multiple sessions between two peers is what I think you're saying. Just for
That is-
clarification.
This is a deployed scenario.
Not
I believe
asking you to
this is what she's
justify it, just asking you to describe it. This is ECMP parallel links.
correct.
Okay, cool.
Yes.
Just a sec. My understanding from, the last time I configured that way was before World War II. But my understanding of that configuration is that the peers are in fact the two loopbacks, and that there is IGP saying with multiple entries on A telling it how to get to the loopback on B.
That is what people do if there's going to be an IGP.
Yes, we also
The
The
classical
IGP is
scenario.
The IGP in this case is usually static.
You would have static routes. It's very classic. It's classical scenario.
So I mean, I think that's also
Gotcha.
if you do between loopbacks and not between individual interfaces addresses, you end up with a stack of them.
You
I
could
think that's the
you could do that.
There are customers who do BGP connections across each of the peering links.
And they're surprised that they get multiple announcements and want to change BGP to stop that.
I did not say this was a problem I wanted to solve. I'm just trying to make sure that this is the problem that Xi is talking about. We want to discuss.
And this could, I believe, be solved in the. I'm not suggesting we do. If we wanted, we could solve this in the discovery protocol, where I could say, this is my loopback. This is the interface I'm using to reach you on. That way there is no real IGP. And you can do loopback to loopback easily enough.
But what Jeff is saying is that they don't want loopbacks. They want multiple point-to-points on the numbered interfaces. And
then you end up with lots of sessions. And this feels like doctor. It hurts when I do
we
that.
understand that, but the point is, what did they want when they ran those parallel wires with multiple BGP sessions? What did they actually, what's the intent of the architecture?
Yeah, I guess if I understand Xiaohu correctly, actually, Chris is asking how to use the loopback address to set up the peers if there are multiple parallel links between two nodes in the data center, and how to make this configuration automatically. We need to automatically generate the static routes to the peer, to the loopback address of the peer, right? This is what we want is to reduce the sessions between two nodes which have multiple links. Is this what you want to propose, Xiaohu?
Yes, you're correct.
So what you're just trying to do is automate the classic configuration I described. Question mark. Where you're actually the only BGP session is between the two loopbacks. You've got parallel links and you're using some form of IGP, and I include static within the class of IGP.
Yes, we want to keep the links between two pairs, and we also want to reduce the EDP session
So
number.
we talked about this and we kind of backed off on it at one time because we didn't want discovery protocol installing routes. But that's another thing where you not only discover what links, you install routes in the routing table to the other side.
Well, it may go that step and maybe one step further.
Mm-hmm.
So in a scenario where you got the two boxes A and B, peering over loopbacks that happen to have multiple parallel links, and the discovery is able to determine that these are the same boxes that share the link. You could spin up routes towards the loopbacks across each of the links, and similarly, to make sure that you don't end up with the usual problem this causes you, that could also spin up a BFD session.
Mm-hmm.
I am not morally opposed to this. I just would like to think about the mechanisms a little more.
And part of the reason, like I said, I make no assertions about how wise it is to spin up multiple eBGP sessions between boxes. I just can tell you that it does get done.
Well,
it does mean that for the customers that may want such things, we need to figure out a way for the cases to be distinct within the discovery and the provisioning mechanisms.
So this is Warren. I mean, I must admit, I like you could also enable BFD while we're doing all of this. I'm somewhat concerned that feels like complexity because we can.
Well, the minute we're installing static routes, we're already routing a little bit.
Yep.
So, and that's actually sort of in the category of what do you do about your transport sessions. So once we figure it out, there's a thing that we want to speak BGP to. We have IP endpoints. We have some idea what we expect the security keys for the transport session are likely to be. For the BGP session, we know something about the expected properties, which may include something that looks like a role. That may similarly include things like AS numbers. Basically, there's room at that point for other things that are tied to the transport session as well. So being able to say, very similar to what's in the Yang models right now, the IGPs, you just basically say BFD yes or no.
I will admit to not having completely bought into roles. And secondly, I'm still on the multiple wires, and I can see some bright genius deciding they want all the odd numbered wires to go into one BGP session and the even numbered wires to go into another. And
Tony Lee's not in the call right now.
Sorry, this is Warren. We did already at one point say that we thought that maybe you should know ahead of time which interfaces were going to be talking this stuff. And if that is your flavor of kink, if you're already configuring something about interfaces, you could say 137 are, session 1, 246 are pipes, or session 2. I'm not suggesting this is a good idea. I still kind of feel like you turn this on a box and then rely on authentication, but you could.
And one of the ways I know that some of our larger customers tend to build out their fabrics is they run sessions to every single box, in massive parallel. They will eventually do some level of skips. So, and that's to some extent a matter of provisioning for them. Yep. So Randy, for roles, let me ask a functional question. So you're building a fabric. You've got a device. It's got links. What do you think that auto discovery should do when you plug this into another box?
Do the minimal exchange needed to bring up BGP?
So you're not worried about misconnectivity as a functional requirement?
I don't think I am at this level. And I don't think roles bail me out of that anyway. Because just because I was expecting a leaf and you gave me a spine, there are 256 spines it could be.
Entirely possible. Part of the reason this gets mentioned is if you misconfigure things, you end up with very odd forwarding.
Oh, I understand.
One of the nice properties that Rift has is that it keeps you from doing some of these things accidentally. Being able to know somewhat what your expected spot in the topology is for standard BGP prevents at least some classes of the stuff. I'm arguing it prevents them all.
This is Warren. There is also some set of folk who like to do things like not really aggregation, but sort of summarization at spines. And so that's why a role might be more useful. I would think that that's something that actually gets, that happens while you're doing pre-configuration.
We understand why a spine might do that, but how will that affect my opening a peering to it?
A place where it does have some impact is that AS number choice question that I raised earlier.
Pretending to think.
Yeah. So to discover the misconnectivity may be something further consideration.
So if roles is predefined and you can signal it, you would at least ensure that leaves don't connect to leaves and so forth.
We did kind of focus on this problem in L3DL, but from a very different style of approach. I'm just not, I don't see a 23% solution as an excuse for any level of complexity. 100% solution, I'll pay for. So maybe one way of hearing what I just said is instead of 3 flavors of roles, finding some way to express who the hell it is I think I'm trying to connect to.
And so in the LDP draft, we did not actually do role because for fabric, we sort of know what the traditional roles happen to be. For other cases that are not fabric, roles can mean other things. I'm not going to list all the examples. The relevant point is that rather than trying to predefine everything under the sun, you just basically put in some sort of opaque tag community, whatever you want to call the thing, a property that is part of the transport, as part of the discovery session, you can use that as a local lookup of this means this device has some properties I'm expecting. That can feed into your templating system, that can feed into whatever happens to make your life a little bit easier.
And this is Warren kind of responding to Randy. If you know ahead of time who you're supposed to be connecting to, then I don't think we need an auto discovery thing. I think we just need something that's basically something like LLDP, and if you don't see the peer you expect, you don't bring up the port or you throw an alarm. I think that's a different problem, I think.
This is John. I've been mostly trying to keep my mouth shut, but to take Warren's point one step further, if you know what role you are, that's the first step towards hand configuring where you are in the topology. So is even that bit of configuration, a step too far down the road away from auto configuring the thing?
Well, the difference between completely zero touch and having some amount of provisioning inside of the system. So if you think about routers that are doing a lot of ZTP type things, in many cases they have something like a DHCP server that's giving them the hand of, hey, here's some properties that you care about, and goes from there. I'm not saying that that's a requirement for this, but some of the properties may end up leading us that direction.
So
AS number assignment's an example.
instead of zero touch, we've got light tickle.
Hopefully not bad touch.
So actually, I mean, I guess that's one of the sort of fundamental questions is, and I suspect the answer is no, but do we what is it?
You're breaking up.
If this could be, it might have just been that I was trying to get my words in order. The one option would be, do we want this to be zero touch? I think we've all been assuming that you initially do some set of config, like AS number and a key. What we're all agreeing.
Well, it's partially why I was talking about things like scoping a little bit earlier on.
Yep.
So scoping can be potentially something that is built into a device profile. So as an example, you buy a box from the vendor and all of these ports are expected to be fabric facing. That's effectively a scoping, potentially it's a role, depending on what sort of device it is. Technically still provisioning in a sense. It's just the provisioning happens to be cooked into the box.
Yeah, and you think about this, other than one, maybe derived through some tricks. So I want to get into that. Other than one loop, you can have a role. You can have a role box, and it can be identical across all boxes. Have this role, right? Like say leaf.
Yeah, practically,
so-
if you do unnumbered and you can auto-derive your ISN, the configuration could be completely identical.
So just to clarify, call up my vendor and say I would like 27 blue boxes and 3 red boxes, and the vendor takes that to mean, this many will be used as leaves, this many will be used as spines. They will have those sort of interfaces, and when they ship them to me, they will have, a role or something similar. This feels a little. I must have misunderstood because that feels a bit sort of restrictive.
It's over restrictive, but it's sort of trying to identify the fact that there is going to be some level of provisioning in this. If it's going to be, I think, flexible enough for people to be comfortable deploying it. And you're calling it blue, you're calling it whatever. Your employer, some of my customers all have magic words they tend to use for a box that happens to occupy a spot in their topology for a specific set of things that it does. And for the most part, you've all got things orchestrated so that the the systems come up, assign the necessary properties to them, run them through tests, and they connect themselves in the appropriate way. And this is all happening because you have a provisioning system that's handling that sort of thing. If you happen to just simply put a USB stick or something like that in, and it gives it exactly the same properties to, this is the USB stick that says you're blue, and it happens to have 5 pieces of configuration instead of 10,000 lines. Do you care one way or the other?
Okay. I thought that, sorry, I kind of understood it as, somebody would sell me a box that is a spine box. And so all of those interfaces are configured in one way. And then I would buy a leaf box, which has the interfaces configured in a different way. And my ordering would determine how it's configured.
And to some extent, it's, you're ordering, I think my own employer, like you pick like a PTX 10K of some sort, you're going to stick it in a given spot in your topology because that's what you've ordered the thing for, and you just need to be able to plug it in and hopefully do the least amount of work to get the thing to come up. That's sort of what...
That's what I would order it for now. In 3 years' time, that same box is going to move from a spine to a leaf, and something else will be bigger as a spine. And so I think we need at least some flexibility for that. Like I often retake boxes that were spines and are no longer interesting enough, or get reprovisioned for something else.
Jeff, one part of just come up is be verified.
Right. So I'm actually going to pick on that point that Igor has made when I've had auto discovery discussions with him. So he's not terribly much a fan of auto discovery at all.
Right.
What he would like that comes out of the work that we're doing is really a verification framework.
Correct.
He likes to talk about how he sort of unit tests, each of the layers of, the device, as things are brought up, interfaces, interface connectivity, IP connectivity, bring up routing with, throw out all routes, all these sorts of things. Having a discovery tool that happens to use some of the stuff, for provisioning also can be effectively a telemetry layer in some sense and help you with debugging. I'm not saying this is a property we should engineer for, but I think there's a good overlap.
Yep.
Yeah. In my understanding, we cannot actually we need some pre-configuration of provisioning at minimum. So the role of this auto discovery is not to make it totally automatic. So maybe we need to identify the minimal set of information which we need to rely on. Then we can try to automatic the other part of this session setup. For example, the AS number. Do we want the AS number to be automatically provisioned or generated in the data center?
Not unless you're changing BGP.
But based on for the IP address, I think if you use link local,
I agree with everything you just said. I think there may be some subset of people that would be happy if we had a way to generate numbered links rather than unnumbered. I don't know, it's worth trying to make that a primary support case. But I think if there's a working point when we finally reach that of just simply saying, how do we pick the AS number for the box in question? And just simply work through a couple of the scenarios, I think some of our operational details and our provisioning models will fall from that.
So to expand a bit on actually what Igor said, he said that I don't want to auto-discover anything. I know exactly where I want things to be. What he did want, however, is to figure out if something isn't de facto connected to what it should be connected to. So some degree of telemetry that comes out of this framework.
Yeah, it's the misconnectivity detection.
Yeah.
So this is Warren. Much of that solved with LDP and something that walks your fabric and says, I was expecting this. Yep, that's what my neighbor says it is. That does require that you have a way to reach all of the boxes.
Right. So that the operational network portion of this stuff, because everybody that's an actual operator in this call, which is not a lot of the developers, usually has a side channel of some sort that is separate from your routing plane to make sure you can manage things. How that ties into the box boot up and provisioning is, I don't know if that's orthogonal discussion or if it's something we need to deal with, but certainly a piece of this. It's very complicated for those circumstances.
I fully agree with Jen's proposal. If we wanted to define a much comprehensive protocol, we may have a very long list of requirements. But my suggestion, at the very beginning, we should focus on the minimum set of requirements, which is much required with the center. For example, I have heard some of you have talked about security, authentication.
Sorry, you broke up. Repeating that?
Hello?
Yes. Would you mind repeating that? The audio dropped out.
Sorry, can you repeat?
Can you repeat what you just said, Xiaohu?
Okay. I fully agree with Jen's proposal. That is, we should focus on the minimum set of requirements. For example, within data center, we don't care much about the authentication issue, since it's a trust environment, a controlled environment. So if we wanted to define a much comprehensive protocol, we may list a lot of requirements. But I still suggest we should focus on the minimum set of requirements at the very beginning. And maybe in the later we could extend more requirements. So we should focus our energy at the beginning on the most required.
So I guess that leads to the what do we think is the most minimal set of requirements? And there, you could make an argument that AS number is not actually in that because
Until
you
you
could just
read the
assume.
BGP spec.
Wait, you could say that everything in my data center is going to be IBGP, and it will all use 65535. And when my data center connects to another data center, I do magic there to swap that for a better number.
I think you need to pop up about 3 levels where we kind of need to agree that we're not telling people how to architect their data center.
Okay. For data center environment, some may be interested on inter-data center scenario. From my side, more interest on intra-data center.
I think we already ruled out inter-data center.
Second.
Yeah, we could focus on the intra-data center, and we may consider the intra-data center.
Yeah, I think we have agreed to work on the intro data center scenario first, right? And yeah, the good question is what is the minimal set of the requirements? I think today we have some very good discussion about the requirements, and maybe the next step is to, based on today's discussion, summarize a small list and exchange it, send it to the mail list, and we can. I hope people can still participate in the mail list discussion on this, so we can finalize the small list soon. Yes.
I believe number of drafts that are mentioned already have requirements section. So we could start with comparing, aligning them, looking how one can contribute to another. And that's a pretty good list, actually.
And much of the point for us to be a design team is to try to come up with some internal discussion and to offer, the what we think is a good idea, to the mailing list.
Yeah.
If we're to the point of just saying we don't care about what we think internally, here's just a giant list that we came up with. A working group solve the problem. We're not a design team.
I don't think we're quite ready to go out to the IDR mailing list.
I'm talking about the design team mail list first.
Right.
Okay.
So
Yeah, I propose with requirements that are already covered by existing draft.
We
Yeah.
can summarize
agree.
the requirements in each draft, and we can try to find the minimal set
Yeah.
based on that.
I think
How about-
Robert and my discussion did pretty much focus. I think the open things are whether you can actually do AS discovery, and a little reading of the RFC might help, and looking at actual implementations and whether we're willing to accept breaking them. And secondly, there seems to be, we had an open issue on roles. For what it's worth, L3DL has an arbitrary list of attributes, of user-defined attributes.
With Jeff's proposal, since many related draft has described the requirement and the problem. My suggestion is we should focus on those requirements which are commonly described in.
So I put your comments to the Etherpad. You can check later whether I get it correct. Okay. I think we already over time for today's meeting. And so the next step, I think we need some people to help to summarize the draft requirements and share it to the design team list. And we will also summarize the requirements we discussed today. Based on it, hope we can find a minimal set maybe by next week. And do people think we need another conference call before the IETF meeting?
Well, Robert is going to suggest that we stay the mailing list as much as possible, just because time zone coordination is challenging.
Yes, yes.
I think that the functional analysis of the drafts is a great idea. I think that a consequence of doing the functional analysis will arrive at a common terminology set of the problems we're trying to solve. I don't think we quite have that yet.
So how do we want to break that up? Should it be the people who wrote the documents try and summarize the requirements in them or use case testing, or should we intentionally swap them around so it's not quite fresh set of eyes, but people who missed the implicit requirements?
What's your suggestion?
I don't think I have one. It was a question. It's more, should we, I don't think it makes sense for everybody to read all of the drafts and write up what they think the requirements in them are.
Yeah,
I don't know if it's each person, if the set of authors for each document should try and summarize the requirements.
I
should do
think
it the other way around.
This approach will lead to a laundry list.
Sorry, which was this approach?
Let's do some comparison to begin with. It's not necessarily a laundry list. I think it would be fair to expect author of every draft to come up with their list of requirements.
He has decided this is an important thing for their solution. Having the full set does make a laundry list, but it also allows you to figure out what the greatest common denominator that is worth doing for the data center scenario is.
Absolutely, that's exactly my point.
Yeah, I think we have the drafts list in the end of this Etherpad. And the last one, the Razuk draft on BGP auto discovery, I think that one is not for data center, right? So we can maybe we need to compare the 4 drafts from a draft issue to draft session setup. Yeah, so I think the authors of the draft should summarize this first, and the other person can also send their opinions based on their review of to this draft.
That sounds reasonable. That will help get rid of the, or deal with the issue of people who've got implicit requirements and haven't documented them.
Yeah. Okay.
The one thing
okay, please.
In the BGP auto discovery draft, some problems and requirements have been described, which are much suitable for the future data center environments. I suggest we could consider them as the initial input of our design team.
I don't think it's fair approach to take one draft and use it. We already have, even though it's our draft. I would expect everybody to come up with list and see how we can provide superset of them or align them, so no one feels, treated unfairly.
I just suggest to use some requirements listed in that draft as an initial input. Then we could evaluate whether some of them or not, whether or not we should extend them.
So I agree. I do suggest one piece of methodology, which is when we're analyzing each of our drafts, let us look at separately first what BGP requirements are there and what information must be discovered for BGP. The second one is the transport requirements. To offer as an example, show whose draft is sort of LDP-like in the sense that it has a hello discovery mechanism, which can then help bootstrap BGP. BGP has the properties that's partially discovered from the hello mechanism.
Just sorry for interrupting. I have to run. I'll read the details later. Thank you. Talk to you soon.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.
And the second one is the transport requirements. So for like LLDP, it's very similar. The difference is that the scoping of the discovery mechanism is link local rather than across IP. Not necessarily good or bad, it just happens to be the way we did things.
There's some difference in this drafts. So we need to first identify the characteristics and the requirements. Then we can discuss to which parties are the common requirements, and based on that we can determine which approach will be more suitable. I think the functionality will be firstly identified of the requirement.
I fully agree that should track independent of specific transport protocol.
Okay. Shelf, maybe you can check it on the Etherpad and add something which missing from your side. Your voice is not maybe a little low sometimes.
Can you repeat it?
No. That's I think it. Yeah. His was to his drafts requirement the group point.
So I hope after this meeting, we can start summarizing the requirements in the drafts and share it on the list. And also I will summarize in today's identify the requirements to the list, to the design team list. Okay.
We want to set a deadline for that.
I hope about this week and by end of this week. That okay?
This Friday.
Friday.
What time zone? You laugh.
Where everyone wakes up on Saturday.
That's good.
That you'll still be having lunch Friday when Asia wakes up.
Understood. Well, just to have everybody by week's end send something in. That way, by Monday we can all be reading the same thing.
Yes, that is reasonable. Okay. I think that's all for today's discussion. Thank you all for your time. And thank you, Sue.
Everyone, and
Yeah.
enjoy the mailing list.
Yeah. Bye.